Hi, this is Joel Duff from thenaturalhistorian.com, and today we're going to ask the question, where is Noah's flood in the geologic record? In particular, we're interested in where the flood ends and the post-flood rocks begin. That's called the post-flood flood boundary problem for young Earth creationists. And we're going to look at some of the models that young Earth creationists have devised to try to identify this post-flood flood boundary. And we're going to test those young Earth models with multituberculates. Didn't say that right. Multituberculates. And you're like, multituberculates? What are those? Well, you have to stick around and find out. But before we talk about multituberculates, let's talk about the geological column, or the geological record. Young Earth creationists believe the world is somewhere around 6,000 years old, and that the majority of the geological formations on Earth have been formed or created via processes that have occurred during those 6,000 years. Part of the reason they believe that is because most of these rocks contain fossils. Fossils represent formerly living things that have lived on the face of the Earth. So how do they get in those rocks? They must have lived at some point in that 6,000 years, and therefore the rocks that hold those fossils must also be less than 6,000 years old. Where do they find an explanation for how all of these different rock formations could have formed just in the last 6,000 years? They look to Noah's flood, a cataclysmic global worldwide event that they propose churned up all the sediments that were formerly there before the flood, including all the living things that were on the Earth at that time, right before the flood occurred, about 4,350 years ago in their young Earth chronology. And that giant cataclysmic event then deposited all these different fossils in those rocks. Well, then the question becomes, when you're looking at rocks on Earth, are they flood rocks, meaning were they deposited during this cataclysmic worldwide event 4,350 years ago? Or were the rocks that you're now looking at, were they some post-flood events or post-flood deposition? So for example, here's an easy example. We have these large mountains in the background. This is in Colorado. This is a Great Sand Dunes National Monument. We have these large mountains made up of granitic material and in addition to a whole bunch of sedimentary and other metamorphic rocks. All of these would be considered by young Earth creationists to have been formed during the Great Flood, and then uplifted during the flood or the later stages of the flood. And then when the water receded from the Earth, much of this erosion that you're seeing would have occurred during that erosive or last or later stages of the global flood. Now, how much of that erosion occurred during the flood versus how much has occurred since the flood, I mean, that actually is a question of post-flood processes versus flood processes. But in this particular example, we see these large sand dunes here that are hundreds of feet tall. Young Earth creationists consider all these sand dunes to be post-flood. So those sand dunes were formed or created after the flood. If you had been in this particular place right after the flood occurred, if Noah had traveled all the way from the Middle East over to Colorado and gazed upon this landscape, what would he have seen? That's really the question in the post-flood and flood boundary. Where does the post-flood world begin? And in a way, when did the processes that we're used to observing in terms of how geological processes occur at rates that we're used to seeing, when and what did they form after the flood? And these sand dunes would be one of those things, saying that, winds after the flood would have mounded up all these sands. And then maybe, what about all the hundreds of feet or maybe 1,000 feet of sediments that are underneath this green landscape here? Well, maybe those are also sediments that were deposited after the flood. All right, let's look at another example. So here are two of my kids, and they are looking for fossils in the side of this hill in Wyoming. And this is Red Gulch area in the Bighorn Basin. This rock right here on this stream bed is just covered with dinosaur footprints. That's the reason we were there, all right, to see the dinosaur footprints. But I also knew that there were fossils in the rock sediments in the strata right above it. and they are doing some collecting of that. Now, but our question is, okay, where are the flood sediments versus where are the post-flood sediments? You know, were these rocks all deposited all at one time in some great flood, some great catastrophe, or were some of these rocks, some of these sediments deposited during a flood, but some of these sediments are the result of actions that occurred after the flood? Well, all young Earth creation, not all, as we're going to see, because we're going to look at the three different models that young Earth creationists have for where to and how to identify the post-flood flood boundary. But most would say that these dinosaur footprints are in rocks that were formed during the flood. Now, forming footprints during a flood, that's a whole other question for another video at a different time. And I've written a lot about that on my blog. But these fossils in these layers above, so where at what point, you know, are my kids scrambling through flood layers and looking for fossils that were deposited in the flood? And if they were deposited during the flood, that would mean in the young Earth worldview that these are organisms that lived prior to the flood, during just the 1,500 years between creation and the flood. But maybe if they were scrambled up this hill and they were start looking in these rocks up here, you know, maybe those are post-flood. You know, maybe this is the boundary right here. Right? These are floods deposited rocks, and then processes that occurred after the flood, these fossils were placed. Now, why is that important? Because the fossils that are in these rocks would be organisms that were alive and therefore captured by this flood event, whereas the organisms in these rocks were alive after the flood and therefore had to be living things that were after the flood and then were deposited in those rocks. Now, what if we found bones from a vertebrate animal right here, and we said these are post-flood? Well, that would mean that that animal would have had to have come from the ark, right? Because vertebrate land animals were presumably preserved on the ark, Noah's Ark. They departed from the ark. They would have had to have traveled to Wyoming, all right, in order to have been encapsulated in this layer of sediment that's the result of some post-flood action. Another flood that occurred after the flood, a local flood, and their bones then got trapped there. And so maybe everything above this point is post-flood, and this is during the flood. That's what's called the flood, post-flood boundary. And where you believe this boundary lies then changes your interpretation of the fossils that you find in it, and as we'll see in a few moments, has a lot of other ramifications. So finding this flood, post-flood boundary is very important because there are many other parts of young Earth creationist flood geology that hinge upon knowing this particular boundary point. Now, what I want to point out is that in this particular picture, these rocks up here are actually quite young, this light red stuff. But everything below this point right here is actually very, very old. It comes from the Cretaceous, so it's more than 65 million years old. The fossils that they're finding in these sediments right here are known from lots of places in the world, but all those places the rocks are dated to be of Cretaceous era, which is sort of the dinosaur age. Right, and so that means that most creationists would place most of these fossils in the flood strata, and probably all the way up to this point, and say that this is possibly the flood, post-flood area. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to the idea of there must be a physical record, right, of actions that happened after the flood versus during the flood. I swiped the title to my talk here today from this New Creation blog post, Where is Noah's Flood in the Geological Record, or Geologic Record? And this is a very nice introduction to the different ideas that creationists have about how to find this post-flood flood boundary. And there's a lot of different views, and there's a lot of disagreement about this among creationists. This has been one of the difficult problems for creationists. Even though it's so important, they haven't been able to come to any kind of firm conclusion on this. And I'm showing this because I'm going to use three of their graphics in order to illustrate the three primary views or three primary positions, or I'll say models, that young Earth creationists have come up with to try to explain where the flood rocks are. So let's start over here with the Neogene Quaternary boundary model. All right, the Neogene is right up in here, this very top layer of the rock layer, representing in traditional chronology just the last few million years. Actually, I guess maybe back around to 10 million years. And so what they would say is, and this represents, I'll put it right here, ICR is the major proponent of this. Not that everybody at ICR believes this, but this is coming from the ICR camp. They are proposing that everything from the Cambrian rock all the way up to the Paleogene and into the Neogene to very, very recently is all deposited by the flood, which means also that any fossils you find in any of these particular layers were all deposited during this 1 year event of the global flood during Noah's time. That's contrasted with the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary model, in which many, I'll say most, young Earth creationists push the flood boundary back to the beginning of the Paleogene, or between the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, for which across the world there's a fairly well-defined place where this occurs. And the easiest thing that you might be able to identify it with is this is the end of the age of the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs don't continue. Any dinosaur lineages that were still alive at the end of the Cretaceous just end there, and they don't proceed into the Paleogene. So it's a very convenient point to sort of say, okay, the flood wiped out all the dinosaurs, as well as tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other species of organisms on Earth that don't then continue their existence above. So maybe that's the post-flood world versus the flood having killed off everything before. This is why this is the most attractive model to young Earth creationists. And this is, AIG would... This is Andrew Snelling. I can't write very well. So that's Answers in Genesis. Then there have been other creationists, the so-called European creationists sometimes, that have taken this late Paleozoic boundary model, in which they go back all the way back into the Pennsylvanian, Mississippian boundary, and they say that the flood only deposited the rocks and fossils that are found in this region. Notably, these are basically oceanic, all right, and aquatic fossils, and no large land vertebrates. And then after you get the Pennsylvania and the Permian, of course, the Permian, you begin to get various reptiles and so forth, and then Triassic and Jurassic. And Cretaceous, you have the age of the dinosaurs, and then it's not until up here in the Jurassic and above you find mammals. And so they're saying like all the major land animals really don't show up until after the flood. It does mean that the flood didn't actually preserve any land, but that's part of their model. They're saying that the flood was so destructive that it didn't preserve any animals in the fossil record, and what is preserved in the rocks above those are all rocks that were formed by post-flood processes while animals were dispersing from the ark, and they were diversifying across the earth, in this extremely short period of time of a few hundred years after the flood. All right, so that's your three primary models, and like I said, this is the major one. All right, this is the one that most creationists, I think, would subscribe to, including what I call the new creationist in some of my previous videos. All right, so I just want to show you that that there's significant disagreement here, and these models result in significant differences of opinion about how to interpret not just the rocks, but then because the fossils are different in those rocks, it also changes their interpretation of how organisms have migrated on the earth after the flood, how they've diversified on the earth after the flood. It changes your opinion about how many individual kinds of organisms might have been on the ark. It has huge ramifications, and creationists know this. And they write one paper after another trying to figure out how to identify this post-flood flood boundary, and yet they can't seem to figure it out, although each one of them seem to be confident that they have it. So, for example, Michael Ord, who is most closely associated maybe with ICR, but is kind of an independent creation scientist, he has this website, the flood post-flood boundary is in the late Cenozoic with very little post-flood catastrophism. Now that's completely different than Snelling and Genesis and others who would say that there was huge amounts of post-flood catastrophes resulting from the Ice Age, and then also plate tectonics still going on, and mountains are forming and all that. All right, so this is a completely different view, and he has a whole book which goes through all the reasons why the post-flood boundary has to be very high. And I've said in the past, his arguments are very, in my mind, quite sound. He's quite right. He points to why the flood boundary can't be lower down, and here's a bunch of examples using data that I think is legitimate data, and yet his model has huge problems too, because Andrews and Genesis can point back, and they have, to here's why it can't be recent. Here's why the post-flood boundary can't be recent. And they're actually right as well. All right, I think both sides are right. Both sides have pointed to fatal flaws in the other side's theories. Maybe that's because neither side is right, but I've talked about that in other places. I don't want to. I want to get to our interesting little critters that are going to test this model, so this video doesn't get too terribly long. All right, so we're back to our models, and I did want to say one other thing about this this very deep boundary, which many of you may not have heard of, and if you follow at all young Earth creationist literature, or if you're into creationist literature, certainly if you don't know young Earth creationism, this is all shocking to you. Okay, let's get back to it. So where is Noah's flood in the geological record? And I want to test these three different models with multituberculates. All right? Multituberculates. You're like, have I ever heard of a multituberculate? Chances are you haven't, unless you're really into mammalian paleontology. Multituberculates don't exist anymore. They're all extinct, but they were formerly a very successful lineage of ancient mammal. There's over 200 identified species, and it's thought that there's probably a lot more than that. They're difficult to identify. They're small mammals, usually known mostly from teeth and jawbones. But there are a few notable, very good skeletons of them that give us a good idea of their overall anatomy. There's a huge diversity of them, and they're placed into 25 different families. So they take these 200 species and they say, like, there's a massive diversity of tuberculates. It's actually in the Tuberculata, which is a class of mammals. So this is a very large grouping. It's kind of like saying the primates, all right, or it's another group like the ungulates, all right. It's a large group of organisms that share similar features. In this case, they share a particular tooth anatomy, which is unique, and no other type of mammal has it. So that's the shared characteristic they have. But they share that particular characteristic. But they have arboreal different forms, meaning they probably lived in trees like squirrels. They're not shown here, but there's apparently one from the Jurassic that was like a flying squirrel, like today's flying squirrels, but they're not squirrels. There's burrowing different kinds. We know that some of them burrowed and they have dens, and we found their fossils inside dens. And so there's this amazing diversity of things that are rat-like creatures or rodent-like creatures in a way, but they're not rodents. Now, why aren't they rodents? Well, they're not placental mammals, which is what almost all mammals are today, except for marsupials, right, that have the pouches. And then, of course, those crazy monotremes that lay eggs. And so what are these? No one's exactly sure, because we don't have any evidence of how they gave birth. It's thought they probably gave birth to live young. But they were more likely, so they were probably like marsupials. There's a bunch of anatomical features that tell us they're not placentals. And so they're similar anatomy to marsupials, but we don't know their actual like behavior or their birthing strategy, right? And they could be egg layers. We don't have any evidence against that, I guess. It just seems unlikely. So anyway, they're not rodents, even though the pictures here might make them look like they're rodents. And they're found, so where do we find them in the fossil record? We find them from the early Jurassic, about 160 million years ago in conventional dating, to the Eocene period, about 30 million years ago in conventional dating. So they lived over 100 million years on the Earth. and were highly successful in the northern hemisphere, but they're also found in the southern hemisphere. And the crucial thing here is that they survive through the KPG boundary, the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, which is where the post-flood boundary for Answers in Genesis lies. And so let's take a look at, well, first let's talk a little bit more about the diversity of them. So here's an image taken at the Ark encounter, all right, Answers in Genesis, Noah Ark exhibit. And on there, of course, they're trying to convince young Earth creationist followers, right, that it's plausible that all the animals that needed to be preserved through this flood could be held on that particular vessel. Right, and so the vessel only has a certain size. They didn't hold every species, they hold 2 of every kind, and so they're interested in discovering what those kinds are. And they have a list of all the kinds. All right, they have this huge list on a wall that lists all the things they think were kinds that were represented on the Ark. And so here are this is just a portion of that list. Here are the mammals that are extinct, that are flightless or gliders. And so all of these different names here represent different families of organisms from the fossil record. None of these are alive, so these are all extinct groups. And what I've highlighted here in blue, these are all the extinct groups, families, that are members of the tuberculates. All right, so these tuberculates, I just said they have a lot of diversity, and they're in like 25 or so families, depending on how you split them up. Answers in Genesis let us say, yeah, those are fairly distinct different types of tuberculates that each appear to be their own family or kind of organism. So there were 25 different kinds on the Ark, and there were 2 of each, so there were 50 tuberculates on the Ark, according to the Answers in Genesis. All right, so now let's think about how that translates to these different models. Before I do that, I want to emphasize a little bit about what was I going to say about this? Oh yeah, early mammal social behavior. So here's a paper that describes tuberculates that were living with dinosaurs. Right, so just to show you that there's strong evidence that tuberculates lived in association with dinosaurs, or mammals lived with dinosaurs. In this case, they found what appear to be burrows with little family units of tuberculates in it. All right, so think of some kind of rodent, like prairie dogs or something like that are living in a mound, and they have family groups, because what they did is they found adults with young offspring all fossilized together. And where those fossils are found are intermixed in an area that's a very famous spot in Montana called Egg Mountain, where there's hundreds of thousands of dinosaur eggs that are found in nesting sites. So here you have the preservation of a giant nesting area for dinosaurs, but within that nesting area for dinosaurs you also have these small mouse-like rodents, mouse-like tuberculates, living there in what appear to be social groups. This is interesting just from the perspective of how do you explain that from a young Earth perspective, since all those rocks, according to the flood boundary, these rocks would be during the flood. In other words, during this chaotic global flood, there was a huge nesting site where hundreds of thousands of eggs were laid by dinosaurs, but also these other animals lived there, made burrows, and died there as well. That's very difficult to explain within a global flood scenario. But I need to point this out, that they lived at that time, because of course I'm going to show that they also lived after the flood boundary too, and that has some important, that's going to be important for assessing these models. So here in another paper in 2012, talking about tuberculates, here we have, and this is, I just want you to focus on this particular figure. So over here we have 160 million years going up to the present. All right, so covering a long period of time. And this graphic here is showing the taxonomic richness or diversity of genera So this says 10. That means there's 10 different genera that have been found in the fossil record that are in rocks that are dated to this age. So you can see before 160 million years ago, there really isn't anything found, and you can go all the way back here to these other rocks from all these other geological periods, and no tuberculates have ever been found in any rocks anywhere in the world from that time period. So then a few tuberculates show up. All right, there's like 1 or 2 genera with a few species. And then there's a bunch of different species in like 10 genera, and then there's sort of a similar amount of diversity that continues to be found in rocks of younger and younger ages. Now, as we get to this line's the important line, right? That's the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. And remember, dinosaurs live all through here, all right? But then right here, all the dinosaurs disappear, all the ones that were alive at the time. They didn't all disappear then, right? Many of them went extinct right here. Many went extinct here. But any of them that were still alive found their doom at the end of the Cretaceous period. So that's what makes these organisms very interesting, because they go right through the boundary there, and they find themselves being as diverse, if not even more diverse, up to 20, almost 25 genera of different kinds of tuberculates are alive after the great extinction of a lot of other organisms on Earth. And then later, millions and millions of years later, after that extinction, they find that their diversity falls way off, and there's just a few genera left that survive all the way out to about 30 million years ago, and then that's it. So there aren't any tuberculates alive today that have ever been found, and there's none in the recent fossil record at all. And these are fairly well preserved, especially their teeth. And so if they were around, we'd probably find them. All right. Now, so that's the data that we want to think about. Let's look at a few other things that we need to consider. So from the Paleodays Navigator, this website where you can type in any type of fossil group, species, genera, family, and it will show you where we have fossils from them, and it'll show you what period the fossils are from. In other words, where in the geological column they are. So I just typed in Multituberculata, which is this large group of organisms with 25 different families contained in it. And you'll see these colors. You see these colors? Every one represents a place where those fossils have been found. It might just be one fossil. It might be hundreds of fossils at that location from this particular taxonomic group. And you'll see the colors here. You got these greens and you have these pinks, right? And those greens and pinks would represent right here, and then there's also some blues, all right? So the blues are Jurassic, then the greens are Cretaceous, and then the pinks are Paleogene, and then the individual shades of them have to do with even much more specific time periods and frames within those periods. And so there aren't any of these other colors because there aren't any known from that time period. So now here's the really fascinating thing, is that you could go down and you could look at each family, and what you find is some families only existed in the Jurassic, all right, and then some families only exist in the Cretaceous, and there are some families that are exclusive to the Paleogene, so different families in different parts of the geological column, but there are some families that exist in the Cretaceous, and the same family or the same types of multituberculates exist in the Cretaceous and in the Paleogene, right? They're the ones that are the survivors through that extinction event. They survive, and they're in both sides. Now, why is that important? Why am I making a big deal about this? Let's go back to our 3 models by young Earth creationists of the flood boundary. So let's take, for example, ICR's Neogene quaternary boundary. It's way up here. Like all the fossils, basically all the fossils in the fossil record are flood fossils, and hardly anything's been preserved after the flood over the last 4,000 years. So where do we find our tuberculates? We find them just in this region here, right? This is the only place we find those fossils. And there are hundreds of thousands of these fossils, right? So it's a pretty good idea this is where they are. And so how would they explain them? They would say like, oh, every single one of those 25 different families, right, all 200 species and the hundreds of thousands of fossils, they're all just part of the flood, right? So those were little critters that were alive before the flood happened, all right, during the pre-flood world. They lived in the pre-flood world. The flood happened, and they got preserved in the flood, and this is the rock they got preserved in. Now, how they only got preserved in that rock and not other rocks, that's a whole nother problem, for the young Earth creationists to try to explain. But that's not our problem for today. But nonetheless, they could say that all of them were just preserved in the flood. Now, that raises another question, and that is, okay, but if there were 25 different families, that would be 25 kinds of tuberculates. Those 25 different kinds, they're land-breathing vertebrate animals, right? And so they needed to be on the ark. So God must have preserved, I'm sure they would say, yes, God took 2 of each one of those kinds, put them on the ark. That preserved them, right? So they survived through this whole ordeal, and then they were deposited and got off of the ark right here, and then went out into this new world. Now, their explanation, they've never written about tuberculates that I can find, but I'm sure their explanation for why we don't find any, neither are there any alive today, but there aren't any in the post-flood fossil record, is that they departed from the ark, and then, maybe the dinosaurs ate them, or, maybe the foxes all ate them. They immediately went extinct. Now, as I've talked about in other places, it doesn't make sense to me that God saves 25 different kinds on the ark and then immediately allows them to go extinct. But let's move on. Let's go over here to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. So this is where it gets most interesting, and this is really the reason I brought up tuberculates and wanted to talk about them, since this is the primary model of young Earth creationism. So here we have tuberculates, and they're surviving in the Jurassic, Cretaceous, and Paleogene. They're saying the flood came along, and there must have been a bunch of tuberculates that were alive before the flood. They got preserved. Again, somehow they only got preserved in the very, very tippy top of the fossil record, not during any of the early stages of the flood. And they got preserved in particular locations, like near dinosaurs and other stuff like that. But then the flood subsides, the animals get off the ark, and now they're living in a new world. And this rock in the Paleogene was made during the post-flood world, which means fossils found in the Paleogene are animals that are descendants of those that were on the ark. Descendants of animals that were on the ark. Do you see what the problem is? Right? And I just told you, some of them are the same families. Right? Some families are here, and they're after the ark. So what we're saying is somehow lots of different families existed before the flood. Right? They were preserved on the ark, and there are other members that weren't preserved. They were killed, and they were preserved in this rock that was flood rock. But then they hopped off, some of these hopped off the ark, and then they wandered out into the world, and then they got preserved again, representing a continuance of their lineages. Now, 3/4 of all the kinds of tuberculates don't go into the Paleogene, so they all went extinct. So that'd be the same as this model over here. They all got preserved, and none of them survived the flood. Or if they did, just on the ark, they were immediately killed after that. But what's intriguing are these families that survive afterwards. Let me go back to this figure here. Many of the organisms that lived here in what now is Montana and Wyoming and so forth, they are only lived in North America. Those families or those species only lived in North America. There are families that lived only in North America, with representatives in North America, that then survived the flood, and then only their descendants are only found in Wyoming and North America again. So this means that they lived in this part of the world. God put them on the ark, which was over here in the Middle East. And then after the flood, they had to meander their way back over here and live here long enough to get preserved in the Paleogene rocks, right above their relatives who were deposited during the flood. Right? So they didn't get preserved anywhere else in the world. It's like they knew, oh, those are my relatives. They live on the other side of the world before the flood. I'm going to go back to my homeland, which now is completely different because it's been absolutely churned up and there's no rock that is even familiar to them. But nonetheless, they go and live on the exact same location where their ancestors were that were deposited in the flood, because they're in the flood rocks, not the post-flood rocks. Right? You see, this is mind-bending to think about. All the things you have to try to ad hoc explain to try to get these fossils in the same location, have these families coexist on both sides of the boundary, the flood boundary. So if we go back to our models, I guess this isn't a problem here, since in this other model, the flood, all the rocks that were put down don't have any tuberculates in them, and the tuberculates only exist after the flood. So all God had to do was preserve them in the flood, preserve them through the flood of Noah's Ark, but not actually preserve any of their relatives that were not in the ark. And then later, at some point after, then these 25 different families get preserved in some of the post-flood rock, but not all of it. That's all very confusing too. Okay, so tuberculates illustrate, this is just one illustration of what we could do hundreds of times over. Right? We could come up with hundreds of examples of organisms that might span this boundary. We find hundreds of organisms that are going to span this boundary and create the same problem for ICR. And we're going to find other problems. Well, everyone finds problems with this model over here on the right side. So the Neogene Quaternary boundary model, they're going to point to issues with the distribution of fossils that this model can't explain. So like this one right here. They're going to say, hey, we can explain these tuberculates better than you can. On the other hand, this model is going to keep going over here and it's like, well, what about canines, right? Canines are 35 different species of living canines and 100 fossil species, but all canines live in this region here, right? Every different kind. And so their model says there were 2 canines on the ark, and they got off and they diversified into all these different kinds and got preserved in the fossil record during this last 65 million years, which is compressed into a couple hundred years, maybe 1,000 years in the young Earth model. Whereas over here, they're going to point to this model. They're going to say, well, how are you going to explain canines? Because where your flood model is, where your boundary is, you're saying that like, oh, wait a second, there's actually like 50 different species of canines alive. Right? They're in the flood record. That means there must have been like 50 different species of canines that were alive when the flood happened. But almost every one of those species goes across the boundary into the post-flood era. So that means, oh, wait a second. Well, that means Noah actually had to preserve all those on the ark. So maybe all those are kinds, except ICR still wants to say, just like AIG, that all canines are one kind. So that would then force them to say, okay, all these species existed before the flood. Then they got shrunk down to just 2 representatives. Then after the ark, they got off the ark and they diversified back into the same 50 species we saw before. And not only that, they had to go to where they were before, or where they were preserved in the flood record. They had to find their ancestors below them as fossils in the rocks and say, like, well, I better die here because I'm going to continue this lineage into the present. At this point. Wow. All right. I don't know if you're probably like really confused. And part of your confusion is I'm not explaining it well. But the other part of your confusion is that these things just don't work. All right. There's so many flaws in these models. There's so much evidence that when you try to start plugging it in, when you take a new group of organisms that has never been tried to be explained before, and you say, like, okay, now how would I apply these to these models? It's like, no, these models don't do you any good at all. That suggests the models don't work. And if they don't work, maybe it suggests the models are just plain wrong. Right? Maybe there just isn't a way to explain this data, because maybe the world is actually old and ancient, and can be all these fossils can be explained in another way. Okay, well, if I haven't done anything else, I hope I've at least shown you that the finding Noah's flood is not easy, for the young Earth creationists, and specifically finding where Noah's flood occurred in the geological column has been a very thorny problem for them. But it's a problem they have to resolve because so many other things about what they want to say are dependent on this flood boundary position. Until they resolve this, they're going to continue to bicker and argue about not just this issue, but a variety of different issues in young Earth creationism. So this is something to watch out for and to be aware of. All right, thanks again for listening. Again, my name's Joel Duff, and you can find my writings at thenaturalhistorian.com and my photography at Beechnut Photography. I'll see you next time.